Hey everybody, I'm Tom Vassell, and today we're taking a look at a game called Pathways.
Oh, no you don't. See, my name's Jeff, and I'm going to take a look at Pathways. That's right, folks. I am Jeff, your tabletop tech here in the Dice Tower, and I'm doing something a little unique today. This is kind of an addendum update to a review that Tom recently did here in the channel about Pathways. This is a light dexterity game using this bamboo board, and the principle here is pretty simple. You're shooting from behind one of these black lines, trying to get your discs in the 1 or 2 rows, depending on game mode, furthest away from you, closest to your opponent. And if you do so, you'll score a variety of points. But as you're sinking your pucks into these little holes on the board, you create pathways to make your future shots possibly a little easier. Now, towards the end of his review, Tom said,
and there's an optional playmat that you can buy that you can play on that board too. But that's not in this game, so I'm not really talking about that.
well, I am. Here is the Pathways mat in all its bright, ready glory. Now, Tom mentioned that there are 2 modes of play using the bamboo board, and there are 6 modes of play using the mat. First of all, the mat will come with these 2 neutral white discs, which are used in a couple different modes of play. You can, of course, also use the black and red discs that are used with the board. You can also order up to 4 additional colors of discs off the Pathways game website. You'll need at least 2 sets if you want to play any of these modes at up to 4 players. Now, let's talk about the different modes. The first mode of play is Dead Center. This game mode combines crokinole with one of my favorite Winter Olympic sports, curling. Now, no, you're not trying to curl these stones across the mat. That'd be pretty awesome, though, but you're trying to end up with as many of your discs closest to the center of this mat than any of your opponent's discs. So in this scenario, both players have several discs in play, but the blue player has these 3 discs closer than this disc from the orange player, so the blue player will get 3 points. The difference here, of course, is that you're shooting from opposite ends of the target, and so it makes it a little harder to hide behind your own shot. Still, this mode is pretty straightforward, and it's a lot of fun to try and knock your opponent's discs out of the way while keeping yours, of course, close and protected to the center. Now, let's ratchet it up here just a little bit. In moving target mode, one of those white discs is placed in the bullseye of the central target. Players are still shooting towards the center of the mat, but now this white disc is the target, which means the eligibility of different discs to score changes as this disc moves about the play area. Now, I really like this mode of play. It is just total chaos, but there are a few things here to consider. First, there's an odd rule to this mode that whoever is not closest to the target will always be the next player to shoot. So one player could end up firing multiple shots in rapid succession, trying to end up closer to this disc. But the rules don't stipulate what to do if then that player runs out of shots, but other players at the table still have more to take. Thankfully, designer Frank Sorrow did mention out on BGG that his inspiration for this mode of play was bocce ball, and that yes, all players should still take all of their remaining shots before the round is over. Now, another thing to consider here is that these central rings on the mat make it fairly easy to determine who is closest to the center of the board. When the target does move, especially if it moves just slightly off of center, it can become very difficult to determine who is closest to the target, especially as these rings throw off your perception of distance to a different location on the mat. Let's face it, this isn't the kind of game you're going to play with a ruler on hand, so just prepare yourself for the occasional argument as to whose shot is indeed closer. Up next is Break the Ice. Now, first of all, this is the first mode of play that will require an extra set of discs in a neutral color, even for a 2-player game, so keep that in mind. The scoring in this mode is similar to that of Dead Center. You're simply trying to get closest to the middle of the board. However, before each round, you'll set up these 12 neutral discs in an unused color to block the center target. This mode of play ups the chaos factor here quite a bit because you're not just trying to blast these tokens out from the center of the mat, you're also contending against these tokens for control of that coveted center space. That's right, these tokens can be closer to the center than another player's, in which case no players would score, and that just adds more tension to this game, which is probably why this mode is the one where you're most likely to be recovering some of these discs from underneath your sofa. Now, I did enjoy this mode quite a bit. At first, my strategy was just trying to blast these things out of the way, play, but then I quickly realized that a better strategy was trying to push them towards your opponent's side of the mat, because then they create a defensive wall for your own tokens, and that just makes this game deliciously tactical. The only downside I would say here is trying to realign all these tokens in the center of the mat between each round. Now the next mode of play simply adds the break the ice setup to the moving target rule set. So you've got neutral stones and a moving target. I don't have to really explain this one any further because it combines all the pros and cons of the last two modes I've mentioned. So let's go ahead and move on to Striker mode. Striker mode changes up the setup significantly, with players arranging 5 discs in a row on the mat for either a 2-player or 4-player teams match, as you see here. Now right away I'll tell you that this setup is not pre-printed on the mat, and not only that, but the art features of this mat aren't exactly symmetrical from side to side, so there's going to be a little bit of a fudge factor right off the get-go. However, after setup, players will use these white stones, kind of like a cue ball in billiards, as shooters to knock their own stones towards the center target. And much like billiards, you have to declare which of your own discs you intend to hit before making your shot. If you don't hit it, that's okay, but if you first hit one of your opponent's discs, then the disc that you intended to hit is removed from play. Now the shooter is also removed from play after each turn, and the scoring in the center works the same as the dead center mode. This mode of play, however, is quite challenging. With just 5 shots available to each player, it becomes crucial to keep your targets close to the center of the board, giving you plenty of options to work with. I did also come across a bit of a possible strategy here, targeting one of your own discs that has already outlived its usefulness and then blasting your opponent's discs out of the way before simply removing your useless disc from play. I don't know if that's entirely legal or not, but the first time I pulled it off, my wife's reaction was a bit like,
All right, you bad boy.
Alright, one last variant to look at. This is the setup for Skirmish, or at least one possible setup shown in the rulebook. In Skirmish mode, each player starts with 2 neutral stones surrounded by 11 stones of their own color. This means that you will need an extra set of discs if you want to easily distinguish between each player's neutral stones. Now to start off, each player will take their 12th token and use it as a shooting disc to get things started. And after that, they'll choose any one of their discs at the start of their turn to use as their next shooter. The object of the game is simply to be the first to remove one of your opponent's neutral stones from play. And if you haven't given your cat a chance to play with any of these tokens, this is probably the mode to let you do so. Even the rulebook suggests that this mode of play can get a bit violent. And I'll tell you, if you've ever played Crokinole and found yourself just with all the urge to flick a disc with all of your might, this is your game. Okay, explaining these 6 modes of play took a bit longer than I expected, so let me give you a quick bottom line. I think the playmat modes of Pathways are great. These are a lot of fun. You can play half a dozen rounds in a half hour or so, change up modes of play as you go, and simply have a lot of fun with up to 3 of your friends. I have a good number of dexterity games, and I tend to enjoy them, but they can get bogged down in their own rules, especially when you try to add in complex themes of space conquest or Western cops and robbers. These games, however, are simple. They can be taught in mere moments and play out just as quickly. I can also tease here that designer Frank Sorrow is looking to give a little more attention to the mat-based games of Pathways, and will be naming this system Pathways Power Strike. You can follow more of that out on BGG. In the meantime, I give these games an 8. However, for this thing, there is something else I want to discuss. In Tom's demo of the base game, you can pretty clearly see how flush these discs sit with the surface of the bamboo board. And that's pretty key, since the core concept here is that these tokens will eventually bridge the gaps and create pathways across this surface. Unfortunately for a lot of backers, myself included, this hasn't been the case. A lot of folks have received copies of this game where the discs are significantly shorter than the main board. And this really kind of defeats the purpose, the entire concept of this game. Even with several discs filling the board, my shots across clear pathways are still often deflected. This is, to put it mildly, a pretty big bummer, and it gets worse when Frank explains that his pre-production sample copies of the game were fantastic, and only when the game went into full production did things start to go awry. There have been so many complaints of essentially defective games that Frank has exhausted his supply of spare parts. Not only that, but the company that has produced this game has quit responding to his calls. Now that doesn't really let Frank off the hook, but it does mean that there's not going to be an easy solution to this problem. It doesn't, however, mean that there's no solution. To Frank's credit, he put together a YouTube video showing how to fix your copy of Pathways without really breaking the bank and without losing the ease of lifting the board off the table and swiping the pieces out of the way to quickly set up for the next round. This fix requires a roll of drawer liner, a good adhesive, and some bingo chips. Now, a few tips. You could probably use a sturdy piece of fabric, but you might want to hem or stitch the edges, which means you want to make sure that the board still sits level when you're done. I was going to use a thin cutting board, but I wanted to be able to use something that could fold up and go into the original box. The adhesive that you use has to work with both foam and plastic, so be sure to read your packaging. Also, bingo chips do work just fine, but I'm what folks refer to as a try-hard, so here's what I did. I measured all the discs in my game and then determined which one was the tallest. I then 3D modeled a simple round disc that was the thickness of the gap between that tallest disc and the thinnest spot on my bamboo board. As the 3D printer went to work, I traced out the outer edge of the board onto the drawer liner, cut it out, and placed the board over top. Frank suggested using a marker to mark the center of each hole, removing the board, and then putting a drop of adhesive onto each of those marks before adding your bingo chips. I made my 3D printed risers closer to the diameter of the holes in the board, so I had to be a bit more precise. I carefully added a dollop of glue to each piece and then manually centered it into each hole, checking my alignment as I went. Note that drawer liner is something of a mesh, so make sure to protect the surface you're working on with some spare cardboard or similar. Let all of this dry and then enjoy Pathways as it's supposed to be played. Was this a pain in the butt? Yes. Do I think anyone should have to do this? No. Am I a bit disappointed in this product, but also sympathetic to the plight of an independent game creator? Yes. Honestly, I'd much rather enjoy this game as the result of a little elbow grease than to simply surrender it as money down the drain. And again, not every copy of Pathways has this problem. Tom's obviously doesn't. Mine totally do. And I get it. You might be saying at this point, nope, no way I'm going to spend that kind of time and effort to fix a game. And I get it, but I might first ask you how much time and money you've spent blinging out a game already in your collection. Personally, I've spent days 3D printing an insert for a single game. The few hours it took to restore this game to its full potential was frankly time well spent. Cheers.